have one announcement, so please remember 4 p.m. today at the Cooper is the roundtable with Professor Boaz. So thank you.
Awesome. We are incredibly lucky today to have Dr. Cynthia Boaz back with us. She's been a faculty in our program for the last few years. This term has been on sabbatical, so she's fresh off the plane to you, bringing greetings from the leprechauns and the good fish and chips and the beautiful scenery of Cork, Ireland. I saw her Facebook the whole way. And her blog, beautiful readings. Professor Boaz is a professor in our political science department. She has a PhD from UC Davis. Are you a California library?
Oh, yes. We're Sonoma County.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. She was on the faculty of SUNY Brockport for some time before that. Her areas of expertise are in strategic nonviolent action, civil resistance, and the quality of democracy in political communications and media. She's an academic advisor for the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict in Washington, D.C., the Human Rights Foundation. She has traveled all over speaking on and researching on behalf of these organizations. She's worked with many of the great veterans of civil rights struggles. And she is the faculty advisor for a model of the United Nations, which is something that many of you would be very interested in experiencing. She's also an affiliated scholar of the UNESCO program in Peace, Conflict, and Development Studies. Professor Cynthia Boaz, please give her a warm welcome.
Wow, it is so weird to be back here. I just have to tell you guys, I've been gone for 3 months, and I didn't just get off the plane, but I'm still, it was about 10 days ago, and I'm still trying to readjust. You get culture shock coming home as much as you do going somewhere else. So, as Scott said, I just got back from spending 3 months in another country. Granted, it's a Western industrialized country, so more similar to the United States than many. But nonetheless, I tried to immerse myself into the culture and the communities there in which I lived, and really kind of confined myself to the bottom southwest corner of Ireland so that I could really study that area and that culture closely. And I didn't really think about this before I left, but it also gave me a really unique opportunity to study American culture and American politics from the outside. So I was able to make some observations about things that I think I wouldn't have made otherwise. Particularly our relationship with guns, which is something that the Irish have complete bewilderment about, as do, I think, most other developed industrialized countries. But anyway, let me get to the theme of the talk. So I'm tasked today with transitioning you all from the theme of this semester, which was identity, to your theme for next semester, which, as I understand it, is globalization and cross-cultural perspectives. So I plan to do that today by using the lens of this thing I'm going to call citizenship, both national and global level citizenship. So all semester, you've been talking about identity and whether it's something that you're assigned by forces beyond yourself, or whether it's defined by your own choices and relationships and actions. And I assume that some of the topics you've studied presume that identity is beyond your conscious control. So things like your nationality, literally the country of citizenship, the country of which you would be assigned a passport, for which you'd be assigned a passport, your race, your ethnicity, your sex and class. Those things are often a given, although many of them can be changed. And I think this semester also you've studied topics that have assumed that identity is more a matter of choice. So things like gender, immigration, and the decision to become a critical thinker or not are all the results of one's own decisions and actions. So the topic I'm going to be talking about today, citizenship, is defined both by these external forces and by choice. So many people hear the term citizenship and they'll think of this simple legal definition, specifically the one where the concept is defined by pure luck. Were you born in the United States or another Western industrialized country or not? And that one simple piece of luck or not can determine a lot in terms of how much struggle you may experience in your life. But the more complex, and I'd argue the more important definition of citizenship is defined by the decisions that you make on a day-to-day basis and your relationship with your larger community and society. So in other words, citizenship can be considered the result of both nature and nurture. Did you guys talk about those things? Okay. But I would argue that nurture is the one that really matters because it means you have some control over your destiny. So let me just insert a caveat, which is that there are different terms and lingo for what I'm referring to as citizenship here. So you might hear terms like civic engagement, activism, affecting change. All of those things are very close to or synonymous with the way that I'm conceptualizing citizenship today. But for the most part today, when I talk about it, I'm going to use the term engaged citizenship or Socratic citizenship. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I'm making that decision in a few minutes. So I know that your FYE professors like your lecturers to have an argument in their talks. So I'm just going to tell you right up front what my argument is. My argument is that you don't deserve to be a citizen of a democratic society if you aren't willing to engage in democratic citizenship. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by democratic citizen and democracy. So you all have heard the term democracy, right? I know that not everyone in here is a political science student, but surely this is a concept that's familiar to you. So at its most basic form, democracy is a type of political system where people, the voters, the polity, are ultimately accountable for their own destiny. So it derives from the ancient Greek concept of government by the people. And in order to understand citizenship in the way that I'm talking about it, we have to really understand the concept of democracy. So any of you heard of Monty Python, the great, brilliant British comedy troupe? So years ago, they put out an amazing film called Monty Python's Quest for the Holy Grail. And in there is a brief little section on the nature of democracy. Monty Python gets it. So here, in this little clip I'm going to show you, they're talking about where democracy comes from and why it depends on the people. So this is King Arthur, by the way, in the Monty Python universe.
Old woman! Ma'am, sorry. What knight lives in that castle over there?
I'm 37.
What?
I'm 37. I'm not old.
Well, I can't just call you man.
You could say Dennis.
I didn't know you were called Dennis.
Well, you didn't bother to find out, did you?
I did say sorry about the old woman, but from behind you looked...
What I object to is you automatically treat me like an inferior.
Well, I am king.
Oh, king, eh? Very nice. And how'd you get that, eh? By exploiting the workers. By hanging on to outdated imperialist dogma which perpetuates the economic and social differences in our society. If there's ever going to be any progress...
Dennis, there's some lovely filth down here. Oh, how'd you do?
How do you do, good lady? I'm Arthur, King of the Britons. Whose castle is that?
King of the who?
The Britons.
Who are the Britons?
Well, we all are. We are all Britons. And I am your king.
I didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective.
You're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship. a self-perpetuating autocracy in which the working classes...
Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again.
Well, that's what it's all about. If only people would...
Please, please, good people, I am in haste. Who lives in that castle?
No one lives there.
Then who is your lord?
We don't have a lord.
What?
I told you, we're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week.
Yes.
But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting.
Yes, I see.
By a civil majority in the case of purely internal affairs.
Be quiet.
But by a 2/3 majority in the case of
Be
more major...
quiet. I order you to be quiet.
Order, who does he think he is?
I am your king.
Well, I didn't vote for you.
You don't vote for kings.
Well, how'd you become king, then?
The Lady of the Lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king. Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. Be quiet! Oh, but you can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. Shut up! I mean, if I went round saying I was an emperor, just because some moistened bint had lobbed a scimitar at me, they'd put me away. Shut up! Will you shut up? Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up! Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help! Help! I'm being repressed! Bloody peasant! Oh, what a giveaway. Did you hear that? Did you hear that, eh? That's what I'm on about. Did you see him repressing me? You saw it, didn't you?
Okay. Genius. By the way, if you've never seen the whole, that whole film, The Holy Grail, I highly recommend it. So, what they're trying to argue there is that the only legitimate form of governance comes from the consent of the people. And what that means for you is you have responsibility. You have responsibility to actively give your consent or to withdraw your consent. But simply existing in the context of a democratic society is not an option for someone who wants to claim democratic rights and freedoms. So again, also along this theme, I have a friend who I had asked to create a message for you. How many of you watched The Daily Show with Jon Stewart? Just a handful of it. How many of you have heard of it? Okay, so at least you've heard of it. So unfortunately, Jon Stewart was not available for this, but the creator and former head writer of The Daily Show, a woman named Liz Winstead, was. And in addition to being one of the most in-demand comedy writers and political writers on television, she's also an advocate for a number of social justice causes, particularly women's rights, but also environmental justice, labor rights, immigrant rights, and so on. So I told her that I was doing this talk, and I asked her to videotape a short message for you. So that's the next, that's the next video we have. It's the Dropbox one.
Hey, Cynthia's class. How you doing? So she's going to try to convince you that being an activist matters. Boy, that sounds boring. But let me tell you what. There is nothing more fulfilling than getting together with your friends and taking down some shithead who's trying to make the world a worse place. When you can say, you know what? I participated, I tried, I did something, it is an awesome feeling. And also, you actually get to have moral superiority because you did something. It ain't fake. You did it. So you know what? Just validate your smugness by doing something outside of yourself, something for your community. Do it. Do it. You know what else? If you do it, you might get laid.
I can neither confirm nor deny that last part. Okay, so coming back to the concept of citizenship as we stereotypically think about it. This is a question I will often ask my students in their first political science class. What descriptions come to mind, or what behaviors come to mind when you think about somebody who is a good citizen? These are some of the most common answers that I get to that question. So students will often answer, well, obeying the laws is something that a good citizen does, okay? And for obvious reasons, that's important, right? If there's no such thing as the rule of law, then society cannot maintain its cohesiveness, right? There's no point to organizing together in some sort of collective social, political, or economic experiment. So of course obeying the laws is important to a degree, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute when we get to Martin Luther King Jr. Being patriotic, that's an answer that I get a lot, and it's a little bit loaded and a little bit unclear, because I think it's safe to say that in this room there's probably about 160 people. We would probably get close to 160 different answers to the question of what does it mean to be patriotic. But in the most simplest definition of that term, I would describe it as unquestioning obedience or adherence to your nation state. Voting, and as a political scientist, I got to get on board with that one for obvious reasons. Voting is the most basic thing that you can do as a citizen in a democratic society to help maintain democracy. And I understand that there are a lot of reasons, especially for people your age, to not vote, to not want to vote. It's overwhelming, there's too much information. I understand that you're probably feeling apathetic or enraged or frustrated with the options that you're given. And I understand that, I can relate to that, but the reality is that, and I'll put this in air quotes, the powers that be would love it if you didn't vote. Because when citizens in a democratic society who have the option of voting do not exercise that right, you're defaulting to the perspective of those very entities, political parties, electeds, whoever they are, that you think you are resisting or opposing by not participating. So even if you just go to the voting booth and write none of the above or other to every single office on your ballot, that's better than not showing up. Serving in the military, and I'll get to that one more in a little bit as well, but you could also expand this to serving in any sort of security forces, police forces, or any public services, so firefighters, for example. Running for public office, so actually going into politics in order to do something, to create policy or to make your own community or your state or your country more just or more humane in some way, or more safe. Maybe that's your priority. And then lastly, volunteering, which is something that we actually promote pretty heavily here at Sonoma State University. There's a lot of different service learning type of programs that promote community service and encourage people to get out in their communities and contribute in that way. Can you think of any others that you would put on this list? Yes. Well, probably. What do you mean by giving back? You mean monetarily, or?
Just doing stuff for your community. Like some people do a job, or maybe even creating a business that helps your community in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that's reciprocal and that supports other citizens, whether it's in a local level community, like in your neighborhood, all the way up to the level of the nation state. I'm not sure that I don't know that it's completely synonymous with volunteering, but I would call that giving back. Absolutely, that counts. Okay. I'm sure that there are many more So maybe this can be a question for those of you who are going to come to the round table today. If you want to expand on this, we can do that a little bit. Along the lines of good citizenship, I thought it might be helpful, in order to illustrate the concept, to put together some specific examples of what we would call archetypes or sort of models of good citizenship that fall into these different categories. So I've come up with a model example of the civil servant, the advocate or activist, the patriot, the activist dissident, and the moral conscience. And so I've got a short video clip for each of the first three. Please tell me that you're familiar with Parks and Rec. I know it just went off the air a few years ago, but you're old enough to know that show, right?
You know how it works.
Okay. You guys know the show? And Leslie knows? Okay, great.
Okay. You know how it works. Write your name down on a piece of paper. No, they don't win a hummingbird. I installed hummingbird feeders in all of the parks, so the winner gets to refill those feeders. Scientifically, hummingbirds are the world's cutest animals. I mean, they're so small, and they have tiny beaks, and they only eat sugar water. I mean, what beats that? Come on, baby monkeys in diapers? Yeah, they do. Baby monkeys in diapers are cute.
Okay, so that clip isn't entirely about that Leslie Knope character being a civil servant, but I thought it was kind of an adorable example of her character. So in that show, those of you who don't know Parks and Rec, Amy Poehler plays the director of, or assistant director of the Department of Parks and Recreation in the town that she lives in Indiana, right? Pawnee, Indiana. And she's the most eager, excited civil servant that you've ever seen in her life. She gets up every day and can't wait to go to work, and just to help make the parks in this tiny little fictional town of Pawnee, Indiana, a little bit better for her community. So I don't personally know very many civil servants who are quite as eager and earnest about their work as Leslie Knope, but I'm sure there are a handful out there. Second example,
Counselors?
really quickly, is a woman named Erin Brockovich. This was a movie that came out, I think, around the time I was in college or grad school. How many of you have heard of Erin Brockovich before? Okay, so about half of you. So really quickly, I'll just tell you that Erin Brockovich, who's portrayed by Julia Roberts here, was working as a paralegal at a law firm that took the cases of a handful of people in a community in Central California who believed that they had been poisoned by PG&E and by some various things, some bad things that PG&E had been doing in terms of leaking toxins into the water, particularly. A lot of people were developing really strange cancers and different birth defects, and PG&E came back fighting with their big corporate dollars, and Brockovich ended up becoming the advocate for this group of people that had been harmed by this major corporation. And so this is a scene where, and this is all based in real life, by the way, this is a scene where the PG&E lawyers are sitting down with Brockovich's law firm and trying to negotiate some sort of deal for the people that have been harmed, for the litigants.
Counselors?
Counselors? Let's be honest here. $20 million is more money than these people have ever dreamed of.
Oh, see, now that pisses me off. First of all, since the demur, we have more than 400 plaintiffs, and let's be honest, we all know there are more out there. They may not be the most sophisticated people, but they do know how to divide, and $20 million isn't shit when you split it between them.
Aaron.
Second of all, these people don't dream about being rich. They dream about being able to watch their kids swim in a pool without worrying that they'll have to have a hysterectomy at the age of 20, like Rosa Diaz, a client of ours, or have their spine deteriorate like Stan Bloom, another client of ours. So before you come back here with another lame-ass offer, I want you to think real hard about what your spine is worth, Mr. Walker. Or what you might expect someone to pay you for your uterus, Miss Sanchez. Then you take out your calculator and you multiply that number by 100. Anything less than that is a waste of our time. By the way, we had that water brought in special for you folks. Came from well in Hinckley.
The poisoned one.
I think this meeting's over.
Damn right it is.
Okay. And then the third and last example of citizenship for which I have a short video clip is of who I'm calling the heroic soldier. I'm actually going to show you a Budweiser beer ad that came out a couple of years ago that, you know, it's a very heartwarming rendering of this heroic soldier archetype.
I missed you.
Feels really good to be back. What's going on up there?
Welcome home, Chuck. This is all for you.
Oh. Are you serious?
Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Chuck Nat home.
Just like with most of these like super sophisticated meta ads, I have no idea what Budweiser actually has to do with what you see in the video there. But I'm sure that you could probably come up with another 10 examples of equally heartwarming videos similar to this, because we love our war heroes, right? All right, and then the last two archetypes I want to talk about are characterized by two figures whose names I hope have come up this semester already, Martin Luther King Jr. and Socrates. So Socrates takes you all the way back to the first lecture of the semester, I think, right? All right. Let's start with Socrates really briefly. I'm going to talk about him in a second as the moral conscience of a democratic society. Can you guys remember back to that very first lecture of the semester and the allegory of the cave? And what do you remember about that lesson that might have anything to do with what I'm talking about today? Any answer is a good answer. Yes, tell me your name. Pierce and I are just going to have a private conversation, guys. Pierce.
You have to be willing and open to an idea of something before you can get into it. If your mind is closed, you're not going to learn anything new, and you're not going to advance.
Okay, perfect. So we're talking about open-mindedness, we're talking about critical thinking, and the willingness and ability to critically examine the world around you, to ask questions, right? To not just simply accept things because you're told that that's the way they are, because some elected politician comes before you with a huge microphone on television, right, and says that that's the way it is. You don't have to accept that. And that's what Socrates was all about. He wasn't about being contrary necessarily. It's more about simply understanding that as a human being, you have a set of inherent faculties, critical thinking faculties, that you as a moral human being have an obligation to use. And in the context of a democratic society, your opportunities are everywhere, And if you don't use them, it's a waste for everyone. Okay. And then have you guys talked about Martin Luther King Jr. at all this semester? Okay. Okay, I'll get to him in a second because I did ask your faculty to have you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail. So we'll get to that in a second, and I'll talk more about King in that context. But really briefly, King, in my mind, is the epitome of the activist dissident, the citizen whose love for democracy is manifested in his willingness to challenge it, to challenge the conventional wisdom, to challenge what was generally understood to be the right way to do things. Okay, and that was a very courageous and in his time and setting a very dangerous position to take. Okay, so I'll come back to him in a second, but really quickly. As you guys, I hope, know from your readings and lectures that have touched on immigration, not all US citizens who have acquired, not all US citizens who are legal citizens, and by that I mean documented citizens, acquired that citizenship through sheer luck. In other words, through being born here. Most of us had that privilege, I'm guessing, but many did not. A handful of people have earned it by, among other things, showing that they have some degree of political and historical literacy. So these are some sample questions from a citizenship test that's given to hopeful new Americans. And in order to pass the test, a test taker must get 80% or more of the answers correct. This is just 5 questions. There are 60 questions on the typical test, and most of them are harder than this. So let's see how many we can answer. So how many amendments are there to the US Constitution? Is anybody confident that you know the answer? 27. Yes, 27, including the Bill of Rights, right? Okay. So you could, if you don't want to include the Bill of Rights, or you consider it a separate document, you can talk about it as 17. But 17 or 27, very good. So anybody who had that answer, well done. Who becomes president if both the president and the vice president die or become incapacitated in some way? Wait, raise your hand. Somebody who feels confident that you know. Yeah. Yes, Speaker of the House. That's the chain of succession. And it's not totally intuitive, right? Which amendments to the Constitution address voting rights? There are 4. Just yell out a couple of numbers of amendments that you think might be correct. Yes? 19th, yes. What did 19th Amendment do? Yes. So women finally got the right to vote about 100 years ago. Yay. What else? What's that? Yes, 15th Amendment. Who got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment? It's one of the Civil War amendments. Extended voting rights to? Yes. What else? All right, I'm just going to move this along because this is getting to be torturous. So 24th Amendment is poll tax, or revokes the poll tax. 26th Amendment extends voting rights to 18-year-olds. In what year was the Constitution ratified? These are questions that people from countries all over the world have to know. You guys are a room full of privileged college students in California. You should know the answers. Yes? No. Yes? You're very close, but not quite. Yes? Yes, 1787. And then lastly, how many times can a senator be elected? Yes. There's no term limits for senators. Correct. Okay. So the ability to obtain the benefits of legal citizenship are obviously not that easy for everyone to get. So my question for you guys is, are you less worthy of being a US citizen if you can't answer these questions? Is anybody less worthy of being a US citizen if they can't answer these questions? What is the ability or lack of ability to answer these questions supposed to tell us? And why do we want people to know these things? Why do we care, right? Rhetorical questions. We can come back to them in the round table if you want. All right, coming back to the issue of citizenship and critical thinking. Another term for this combination of concepts, citizenship and critical thinking, is this notion of Socratic citizenship. The reason it's called Socratic citizenship after Socrates is that Socrates believed that it was our moral responsibility to use our ability to reason for good. He was considered the ideal citizen in his setting because he submitted to the city of Athens' laws, which called for him to be killed for corrupting the youth of Athens. Now, so in other words, Socrates was considered a good citizen because he went along with being killed. Okay, think about that for a second. So you could argue that he submitted to those laws because he believed it was moral and his citizenly duty, his civic duty, to obey the laws. Okay? Or you could argue that he submitted to them because he wanted to show the people of Athens how backwards and barbaric their laws were. And by sacrificing himself for a greater good, he paid the ultimate price for upholding the law. The lesson there being, not all laws are moral. Laws are made by humans. Even the Constitution was written by humans, who, spoiler alert, are fallible. This is something that Martin Luther King also wants you to think about. More on that in a minute. Another example I just want to bring up for you today, because this is an example of kind of the worst case scenario, the dystopian concept of citizenship, is a young man named Pavlik Morozov, who lived under the Stalin era in the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. Is there by any chance anyone in this room who's ever heard of Pavlik Morozov? Okay. So Pavlik became a hero in the Soviet Union, in the Stalinist, very totalitarian state of the USSR, because of this story. He was famous because in the late 1930s there was a famine going on. And nonetheless, Stalin, who was, I'm sure you know, a very brutal totalitarian dictator who ultimately killed more people than most other 20th century tyrants combined, had decided to go ahead and export grain abroad, take it away from the people of Soviet Union so that he could sell it and make money for the state. What that meant was people who owned small agrarian farms had to give up, in some cases, all of their grain, all of their food for the coming months or years in order to not be breaking the law. So Pavlik's parents, who were poor farmers, stored away a little bit of grain for the upcoming winter. I think it was the winter of 1938. And Pavlik, who had been indoctrinated into the concept of what Soviet citizenship meant by his school, by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its various minions, believed that his loyalty lied more with the nation state, and particularly with the Communist Party, than it did with his own family. So he went to the local party chief and he told on his parents. He said, my mom and dad are storing grain in our barn, and I want you to know. And so he's about 12 years old when this happened. And the local party chiefs came and arrested his parents. They were both sent to outer Siberia, where they both died in labor camps. And Pavlik became the great Soviet hero. His picture was put up in every classroom throughout the entire Soviet Union, from Vladivostok to Moscow, so that all the school children could see that this was how you were supposed to be. This was the model of what great citizenship was, to have loyalty to your political party and your state over your own family, or even, you could argue, over humanity. And this wasn't his fault. He was a young kid. He had just been, he just hadn't learned or been trained in the ability to critical think. But he's an example of the worst case scenario. And then lastly, I just want to talk about the role of skepticism in citizenship. Because what the Pavlik-Morozov story tells us is that we can't let our sense of obligation to our country or our government or a political party or even, God forbid, one person overwhelm our identity to such a degree that it compromises our own humanity. We need a healthy dose of skepticism. We need to have the ability to ask whether or not what we're about to do is just. So we have to have a willingness and ability to question what we are told. And so that is what I'm calling skepticism, or healthy skepticism here. But it's also possible to become too skeptical. So I would also ask you to think about at what point healthy skepticism becomes cynicism. We hear a lot of cynicism in American politics today. And I would argue that this distinction between skepticism and cynicism is critical, because cynicism in a democratic context, in my view, reflects a kind of moral cowardice. Democracy is dependent upon people believing in the concept, people believing that it can work and understanding their responsibility in that. And it has to be maintained. Everybody has a role in that. But when people become so cynical that they withdraw completely from participating in civil society, whether because they're apathetic, or they're enraged, or they're afraid, then democracy can't be sustained. And then, finally, moving on to the example that I asked you all to read for today, Martin Luther King Jr., who, again, I would argue is the model contemporary Socratic citizen. And his letter from a Birmingham jail, which I will propose is the single greatest piece of writing on democracy or citizenship ever written. So really quickly, the context for the letter. So it was written in 1963. Martin Luther King Jr. was in prison in Birmingham for inciting riots, or not really riots, but that's what they were called, but rallies, protests in that city. And so he had a lot to do, because he was sitting around in jail, kind of pondering his fate and the fate of his community. And right before he had gone into jail, he received a letter. It was actually made into a public letter, open letter, to him that was signed by about a dozen white Southern Christian preachers and ministers who pleaded with him to stop what he was doing and to call off the civil rights campaigns in Birmingham and other parts of the South, because these religious leaders, Christian religious leaders, argued it was provoking violence. So they put the burden of provoking violence on King. So Letter from a Birmingham Jail is his response to that claim on the part of these Southern preachers. And I think that that's really important to understand when you're, I don't know if you knew that before you read the letter or not, but when you're thinking about it in retrospect, I think it's really helpful to understand who his audience is. His audience is these white Christian ministers, okay? Who, by the way, not only claim to be good Christians, they claim to be good democratic citizens. And before I go into the key takeaways from the argument, I just want to note that isn't it amazing that more than 50 years later, all of this is still relevant? Maybe amazing isn't quite the right word. Maybe tragic is the right word. So some of the key arguments in Martin Luther King's letter, this is a direct quote from the letter where he argues, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What is he saying there? I mean, somebody translate that into other words that have meaning in the context of citizenship. What is he saying to you? We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. What's he saying? I don't care if I go over time, you guys are going to stay because we're going to finish this. It's your last lecture, you need to hear this. We'll move it along quickly, though, if you guys respond. Why does he want you to know that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? It sets an example. Okay. You should, I didn't see who said that. Okay. You should care about what happens to other people elsewhere, right? Why? I mean, not just because it makes you a good moral person, although that's important too, right? Empathy, compassion, all those things. But also, yeah? Exactly. Thank you. Okay, now we can move on to the next one. Ends and means are inseparable. This is another key argument in the letter. About that, he says, over the past few years, I've consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. I've tried to make it clear that it's wrong to use immoral ends to obtain moral means. He's talking about violence there, you guys. He's trying to say you can't create a just, humane, healthy, democratic society through violence. Because whatever's created through violence has to be maintained through violence. The creation of a system through violence is inherently illegitimate. That is what he is saying there. Law and morality don't always coincide. We talked about that a little bit already. And he gives some good examples here. He says, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. And I would advocate that I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a moral but a legal responsibility to obey just laws, but one also has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And then he says, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with moral law. An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law or natural law, and any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades it is unjust. And we should never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did to resist Hitler was illegal. Does this scare you at all to know that laws can be wrong or immoral or unjust? It should. But it should also empower you. He further argues that when law and morality come into conflict, it's your job to resist the law and what he calls civil disobedience. There's a lot of terms for this concept. Civil disobedience, civil resistance, nonviolent struggle, etc. And then lastly, he says, if we're not actively resisting injustice, if you're not going out every day trying to do something to fight the injustice, the various injustices that you inevitably see if you're paying attention, which is also important, I should have talked about that first, then you're complicit in upholding it. It's just as much your fault as it is the people who are actually actively carrying out the injustice, because your job as a democratic citizen is to make sure that when law and morality conflict, it gets fixed. That's your job. And he talks extensively about his disappointment with the white moderate, something that may have made some of you uncomfortable when you're reading it. What he argues about the white moderate in 1963 is completely applicable today, especially when we look at the pushback against the Black Lives Matter movement in the form of the All Lives Matter meme. And he argues on this, I've reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice. Okay? All right, so I know that, so now you guys are actually leaving because I'm running out of time. So let me just sum this up. For those of you who are able and willing to stay, moral conscience. You have a moral obligation to be a critical thinker. That's Socrates. You have a moral obligation to have integrity in your conduct in the context of citizenship. You have a job as a citizen to obey the laws to a degree, unless they're unjust. You also have an obligation to examine yourself, to understand yourself and your own role and responsibility or complicity in your context, in your society or political system. And you have to recognize the consequences of your actions. And I should add here, the consequences of your inactions as well. I'll skip through that. These are some of the specific issues that I'm going to ask you to think about. We could talk about these today at the round table. What can democratic citizens do about some of these issues? Immigration, poverty and inequality, environmental threats, gender justice, or I should have written gender injustice, racism, ethnocentrism and bigotry, mass shootings, and more. I mean, this is hardly an exhaustive list of challenges to democracy. And then finally, some questions for discussion that you can take up in your sections, or we can talk about today at the round table. But think about, who is your ideal democratic citizen and why? Do you consider yourself a good citizen? And if so, why? If not, why not? What more can you do to contribute to the maintenance of your democracy? What prevents you from becoming more involved? And finally, and this is what I hope you will take up at the beginning of next semester, what special obligations do Americans have in our privileged setting to be good global citizens? All right, thank you for staying.